seat?
I'll sit here, it's fine.
No,
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Calvin, why don't you and I switch and I'll sit back there? No, it's all right. I'm just looking for my glasses.
Good morning, Chuck. How are you? Good to see you. Good to see you.
I'm not even late today.
Say again?
I'm not even late today.
Okay, oh, that's progress.
That's good.
Good. Busy, but good. Yes.
Busy's good.
Busy is
Love
good.
this
Yeah.
course.
Oh, I'm
Love
glad.
this course. Thank you.
We'll see how it goes.
That's very relevant. Very relevant, very helpful.
We give it a try.
Yeah,
We give it
thank
a try. Have some coffee or some water. Oh, good morning. How are you? Good to see you. Good to see you.
You're gonna have no arms left.
We get 1-4, so for yeah. When people come late, it's good to ask them to go from the back.
Yes.
When this is for you.
Thank you.
You might want to put it on.
Good morning and welcome to you and to the people who are following the lecture, the talk via the live stream. So we carry on a series of lectures on the question of evil and suffering. And as I said last time, we are going to spend most of the next few months, at least until Christmas, to map the issue with the help of literature, of novel. And I hope that last week, when we looked at the character of Simon in the novel by William Golding, we got an idea of a sense of why this makes sense. We saw that when it comes to dealing with the issue of evil, or with the reality rather of evil, the character of Piggy we saw last time, so reason and science was unable really to control the unfolding of the events, whereas the visionary, the character that represents mysticism, spirituality, that has eyes to see somehow even through his own illness. This was the case. It was someone very frail. These eyes really see that which others don't see. So my hope is that really these novels are going to help us to get a perspective on the issue of evil which is not a rationalistic one. It's not one that tries to explain, because I mean there's probably very little to explain when it comes to evil, but tries to get some insight into it. Anyway, so the novel I've chosen for today is much less known or well known than William Golding's Lord of the Flies. It came out almost 10 years ago, and it was recommended to me by a friend, and I remember I was completely hooked from the beginning, which is something I didn't necessarily like, because for those of you who have read this novel, know that it is a particularly gruesome one, is one that really is very, very bleak. although it's punctuated by moments of incredible beauty, there is love, there is hope in the novel at some points, but the kind of the negativity seems to overcome in the end. So I remember I was in New York. I was visiting New York when I started to read it. I was in the middle, and I didn't do anything. I didn't go to any gallery, any museum. I didn't see almost any friend because I was so hooked by the book that I kept going from coffee shop to coffee shop. It was winter. It was very, very cold. Just reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. I couldn't stop. So the novel was published in 2015. The author is Hanya Yanagihara, and it explores the life of a character called Jude St. Francis. We see that the name might have some significance in the end. A talented and successful lawyer in New York City who struggles to cope with his traumatic childhood. And it is mainly a meditation on psychology of trauma. There is much more going on in the novel, but this seems to be one of the foci, depicting the ways in which suffering can derail a life beyond recovery. So I'll give you a plot summary. As always, I've told you, even if you have not read the novels, don't worry, because I'll give you a plot, I'll give you quotations and the points, and I'll illustrate as much as I can the points I'm trying to make through these novels in ways that can be understood even by people who have not read the novels. So initially, none of the characters of the novel knows anything specific about Jude's background, his family history, his sexuality, or even his race. He is an elusive and mysterious character until he injures himself badly in what looks like a suicide attempt, the first of 3 in the novel, despite his denials, creating the first glimpse into his troubled psyche. And the fact we are going to see that what has happened to him is unknown at the beginning and for a while in the novel is significant in itself. So the reader learns, number 3, that Jude habitually cuts himself and about his traumatic past. He's been abandoned by his parents, he's been raised by monks who sexually abused him, and he sports an injury, a spinal injury, that is not explained at the beginning. Gradually, Jude develops a close relationship with one of his law professors, Harold, who with his wife adopts him. So it seems that a first glimpse of hope is being adopted by a couple. Finally, he can find some peace, right? So Jude takes a job at a prestigious law firm and becomes very, very wealthy. Okay, again, seems to be fortunate. He has the money, he can cure himself, he can have therapy, expensive therapy. He's been adopted, so things can only get better. But his suffering, especially physical suffering because of his legs, gets worse. Then he enters into an abusive relationship with a man named Caleb. In some of the most horrific pages of the book, this man treats Jude's disability with cruelty, accusing him of weakness, and eventually beats him until he leaves him unconscious and badly injured, needing hospitalization. And this allows him to get out of this relationship. Finally, number 7, the trauma from this relationship becomes too much to bear, and Jude attempts suicide a second time. And then we have these flashbacks, okay? And the fact that the memory of his past comes through flashbacks is significant in itself about the psychology of trauma. It's kind of something that pierces through despite a strong mechanism to keep everything under cover. So the reader discovers that one of the monks of the monastery not only raped him, but then convinced him to live with him, and then kept abusing him and prostituting him. And at the same time, again, the alternation between this and the kind of positive aspects, Jude and one of the characters, Willem, transition from a friendship into a romantic relationship. As they attempt to work through Jude's continual cutting and fear of physical intimacy, Jude's physical health declines and a bone infection leads to the amputation of his lower legs. So the cutting is mentioned here. So probably the hardest part of the novel is self-harm. It's something that, it's repeated. The descriptions are really very, very difficult to deal with. And the fact that it occupies a disproportionate amount of the narrative. I find this is really challenging. I mean, the author is not stupid. She's an incredibly good writer. So one can wonder why it might be enough to say once, so he hurt himself, full stop. Why having to almost describe the self-harm as many times as it actually happens, and why having to go into so many details? This is a question worth asking. So through new flashbacks, the reader learns that after escaping Brother Luke, Jude was sent to a home for parentless children and abused there too. Then he runs away. He's kidnapped by. So it really is a kind of a story which is almost unbelievable. Almost unbelievable. One can say, is it possible that in one single life there should be so much darkness and so much abuse? Well, the reality seems to be that abuse is something that sticks and seems to repeat itself. Not because people want to be abused, far from that, but there is a kind of there is something about the experience of abuse that seems to expose people to this happening again, and it's something very mysterious very difficult to understand. So Willem, number 11, Jude's partner, is the only person who has managed to really get close to him, but in a triumph of tragedy, dies tragically in an accident, and Jude finds himself unable to process his grief. Eventually, he decides to try to kill himself. His friends again save him and force him to hospitalize. One evening, he lashes out violently at his adoptive parents, Harold and Julia, and finds solace in the fact that they love him anyway, despite his inability to heal, despite his anger at the people who are trying to help him, despite his repeated attempt at committing suicide, which obviously hurts the people who love him. They keep loving him. He cannot push them away despite his best attempts. So this is, some of the most beautiful aspects of the novel. And the last part of the novel is so there is a change of gear at the end of the novel. I remember, I'll be quite frank, I basically cried through the last 50 pages of the novel because it's, on one hand, there is more distance in the narrative because it is, there is this first-person narrative of what has happened at some point by the adoptive father, Harold, who reveals that Jude has killed himself despite reaching a relative balance after Willem's death, but he never recovered emotionally from this loss or from his childhood trauma. Harold also relates that before dying, Jude left notes for his loved ones, including Willem, etc. Sorry, there is a little typo here, to whom he finally reveals the whole story. So the whole story about his trauma really comes to or is revealed to the reader only at the end. So for the whole time, the characters, the friends, the reader is positioned as a position of advantage because he knows everything. But the other characters discover, the friends, the family, the real extent of the damage and the trauma that Jude has received only at the end through these letters he sends to them, and in which, and that's the triumph of the tragedy, he apologizes for it as if they would think less of him upon learning it. Now, this is a very, very sketchy, it's a novel which is 800 pages, 900 pages, so there's a lot more going on in the novel, but this is, I'm going to focus on the character, the main character, Jude, and this is really gives you a sense of the story if you have not read the novel. Now, how the novel works, number 13. The novel has been praised by some for its emotional intensity, and yet berated for its relentless and at times unbearable portrayal of trauma and self-violence. I know a number of people who have not been able to go to keep reading the novel. I mean, they reach a point and they really give up because it seems almost voyeuristic, and it seems almost, I don't know, almost intruding into something that should not be shared in this way. Why do I have to be, or why do I have to subject myself to this onslaught, wave after wave of such unbearable description of self-harm? So Yanagihara pursues a double strategy, number 14. She brings the reader into unnervingly close proximity to Jude's suffering. It is intentional. It is intentional. While at the same time withholding the perspective into his experience through a first-person narrator. So we don't get into Jude's mind. It's not him telling his own story. So we are exposed to what happens to him, and yet at the same time we are outside him. Jude's horrific suffering may not ever be comprehended cognitively due to its overwhelming nature. It can only be transmitted in its inherently and unrepresentable quality. One of the problems probably we have as moderns, as post-Freudian, is that we have plenty of description of trauma. We talk about PTSD all the time. A lot of us might have done therapy. I've done 3, so I know about therapies. So we think we know. We think we understand. We think that we know what it is. But no, we don't know. We don't know what trauma is. Only the persons who undergo or who experience trauma, not even them understand what's happening in their lives, or are forced, are forced to suffer the consequences of what has happened to them. At the same time, the constant description of self-harm, number 15, is meant to convey the compulsive aspect of traumatic experience, something which cannot be really understood unless one is forced to witness its relentless character. That's the point. Nobody can really understand what trauma is and what trauma does unless one is forced to. Nobody wants to see it. Everyone recoils, not only in the presence of suffering. Already suffering is something that we tend to avoid unless we have to. But when it comes to witnessing this kind of numb and dogged and unhealable and mad form of suffering, we just don't want to see it. We just want to flee away. Okay, and the strategy, hence the intentional strategy of the novelist of kind of almost forcing us, taking us, almost like putting a, when you want to force someone to do something, she does basically the same thing. And she does it, with this kind of luring almost, suggesting that it's going to get better. It's going to get better. Just, stay a little longer, endure a little longer this kind of this unbearable like sight, and you will see it's gonna get better. And this is one of the ways she does it. And but the character never gets better. Hence the frustration of the reader kind of grows and grows and grows. It is intentional because only this can give us a glimpse into the reality of what trauma really is. So there is this quotation in number 15, just as Jude, it's not from the novel, it's from a commentator, just as Jude cannot help but relive and reenact the overwhelming events of his traumatic childhood, so too can the reader not help but bear witness to this often unbearable reenactment, a narratively intrusive and complicit premise that appears to have moved and appalled readers in equal measures. To give you a first quotation of the novel, I'm going to skip the the second quotation. The experience, this is a quotation still by a commentator, the experience of trauma repeats itself exactly and unremittingly through the unknowing acts of the survivor and against his will. Just as the survivor is subjected to these compulsive behaviors against his will, he doesn't want to, he has no choice, so the reader is forced to do the same, to have a sense of the compulsive nature of what's happening to them. And the last quotation in this, number 15, is from the novel. He, Jude, was never able to explain to Willem what the catting did for him in a way he'd understand, how it made him feel like his body, his life, was truly his and no one else's. Paradoxically, self-harm was a way of owning his body, which had been taken away from him through the abuse he had suffered starting from a very early age. So what tempers the gruesome aspect of the novel, as I told you earlier, is the love that surrounds Jude from his friends and especially from Willem. They learn how to love him as somehow not to intrude into his suffering. At several points, Jude seems to get better. He seems to have found a balance in his relationship with Willem. Even after Willem's death, he appears to get better, only to commit suicide in the end. In this way, the novel keeps the reader, like Jude's friends, hoping for the possibility that Jude might recover from his trauma and the self-destructive behavior associated to it. This is what makes all the more poignant Jude's eventually inability to heal. So I'm going to give you some quotation from the novel that illustrates the points I've given to you so far. The first one is that Jude is unknowable. He has hidden himself, he is protecting himself by being hidden under this extreme kind of reserve about his life and who he is. We never see him, Jude, with anyone. We don't know what race he is, we don't know, and even the novelist doesn't explain much about him, especially at the beginning. We don't know anything about him. He's post-sexual, post-racial, post-identity, post-past. The postman, Jude the postman, there is one of the chapters of the book, it's about this. He, Jude, was always lying to Willem, big lies, small lies. The entire relationship was a lie. Willem thought he was one person, and really he wasn't. Okay? Lying is the only option he has because what he's doing, something that he fears his friends, and rightly probably, at least with some people, would drive people away from him. I'm going to number 19. In other words, because of their love for him, what happens is that Jude's friends consider that his inability of overcoming the compulsions caused by his trauma are a form of selfishness. That's the irony also, the tragic irony of these of the situation of people who are have this level of traumas, is that they the people get, probably understandably impatient with them. Why, with all the love we give you, why with all the help we give you, why with all the therapy, and then look at yourself, you've been adopted by a couple, you have become very wealthy, you are a successful lawyer, what are you complaining about? I mean, stop moping. That would be the reaction most of us are wanting to have. Except that in the case of a serious trauma, it's not selfishness. Is that one is truly a prisoner of these mechanisms. The quotation in number 19: "The person I was will always be the person I am." Here we hear Jude's voice. He, Jude, realizes. The context may have changed. He talks about himself in the third person. He, Jude, may be in his apartment. He may have a job that he enjoys and that pays him well. And he may have parents and friends he loves. He may be respected in court. He may even be feared. But fundamentally, he is the same person, a person who inspires disgust, a person meant to be hated. Because, the abuse he has received is compounded by has caused a deep self-loathing. A deep self-loathing has been internalized. He thinks of himself as someone not deserving love, someone who inspires disgust, as he says. An exception seems initially to be Willem, who becomes his partner eventually, who learns to accept that wanting Jude to get better is not necessarily helpful. Willem's feelings in number 20 for Jude were complicated. He loved him, that part was simple, and feared for him, and sometimes felt as much his older brother and protector as his friend. And then the other quotation: "They all loved Jude and admired him, but he, Willem, often felt that Jude had let him see a little more of him, just a little, than he had shown the others, and was unsure what he was supposed to do with that knowledge." So Jude gives the impression of getting better in number 22. I'm not going to read. There is a long quotation you can read by yourself. I'm just going to go at the end of that quotation, just before number 23 in your handout, the quotation just above the part which is underlined. He, Jude, hadn't understood why they wanted him to stay alive, only that they had, and so he had done it. So there's the point in which he decides to stay alive, not for himself, but because his friends want him to. Eventually, he had learned how to rediscover contentment, joy, even. Okay, so things are going to get better, right? So, on one hand, there is, and this is one of the things that is really mercilessly kind of singled out by the novel, is the fact that however much they want to respect his suffering, Jude's friends cannot help wanting to repair him. So I'm going to read the second quotation in number 23. "Somehow, in the past 7 months, he, Willem, had decided that he was going to repair Jude, that he was going to fix him, when really he didn't need fixing. Jude had always taken him at face value. So Jude had already accepted Willem. He, Willem, needed to try to do the same for him." And then the other quotation: "Patience, stubbornness, love. He, Willem, had to believe that these would be enough, while they are not. He had to believe that they would be stronger than any habit of Jude's, no matter how long or diligently practiced." So Jude tries and tries and tries and tries, and at one point, and this is also quite significant, and it is confirmed by those who study psychology of trauma, number 24, that even therapy reveals itself to be useless. He had never before questioned that therapy was at worst a benign treatment, number 24. When he was younger, he had even considered it a form of luxury, this right to speak about his life, essentially uninterrupted for 50 minutes, proof that he had somehow become someone whose life deserved such lengthy consideration, such an indulgent listener. But now he was conscious of his own impatience with what he had begun to see as the sinister pedantry of therapy, its suggestion that life was somehow reparable, that there existed a social norm and that the patient was being guided toward conforming to it. The social norm is being well, and if you're not well, you're not conforming to it. Now, it's not an indictment on therapy in general, of course. Here we are just revealed, and of course therapy helped him and helps, but we also revealed that it's not a panacea, and that there are cases where therapy can support but doesn't solve, and it may be asked whether therapy ever resolves problem. Probably the best it can do is teach us how to live with them. In the end, number 25, the novel leads the reader to ask themselves the question whether a self that has been systematically destroyed an endless amount of times has any chance of rebuilding itself afterward. Not even the purity and selflessness of Harold's and William's love for Jude can ultimately undo the damage done to him in the past. Yet he died so alone. This is one of the last pages of the novel, and some of the most poignant. That he died so alone is more than I can think, says Harold. That he died thinking he owed us an apology is worse. That he died still stubbornly believing everything he was taught about himself, after you, after me, after all of us who loved him, makes me think that my life has been a failure after all, that I failed at the one thing that counted. Now, I want to give a couple of considerations about the novel, and then some conclusions that I hope will help us to see how this novel gestures somehow towards or gives us some insight into the question of evil and suffering. So the Greek trauma means, the word trauma in Greek means wound or injury inflicted on a body, but it has come to be used for a wound inflicted not upon a body but upon the mind. It is not like the wound of the body, I'm quoting an expert on these issues, a simple and healable event, but rather an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly, to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again. Okay? Now, a lot of us can have been subjected to small traumas. I remember my mum had a car accident, and she was unscathed, and for months afterwards, whenever she was in the car, she was very, very tense. That's in a small way says what happens with a traumatic experience. But obviously, when it's commensurate to the extent of the hurt which has been received at the beginning, how early in life it has been received. It is the bodily response, trauma, to an overwhelming experience of sudden and catastrophic events that occurs in the often delayed, uncontrolled, repetitive appearance of hallucinations and other intrusive phenomena. What returns to haunt the victim is not only the reality of the violent event, but also the reality of the way that its violence has not been fully known. When experiencing a lot of people immediately after have undergone even abuse, they have a tendency to downplay it, not because it has not been violent, it has not had an effect, a devastating effect, but because the violence of these events manifests itself only with time. Hence, the necessity to have to allow which has been the case, these cases to resurface even after 10, 20, 30 years, because often, especially abuse in childhood, something that really comes to the surface only after a considerable amount of time. There is a difference between the experience of suffering and trauma. Every human person will experience suffering during their lifetimes, but not everyone will experience trauma, or at least trauma at those levels. Experiences of suffering, no matter how difficult, are eventually integrated into one's identity. Okay? As the Queen Mother said, she lost her husband very, very early on, and she was comforting another widow, and she said to her, "You never get over it. You get good at it." Okay, and I found this interesting. So you never get over it, you get good at it, which means that there are ways in which suffering can be integrated. But experiences of trauma resist this integration. The traumatized person experiences ruptures in their bodily integrity and identity. Hyper-aroused nervous systems becomes a bodily thing. Ruptures in language and cognition such that they do not necessarily remember or cannot articulate their trauma experiences. These traumatic experiences push into the present through hallucinations, nightmares, and flashbacks, hence the flashbacks of the novel. And I'm going to quote only the other passage from Kathy Darren, I think, Carruth, who is a specialist on trauma, about the role played by the body. We think about, trauma as being a kind of a mental, kind of psychological kind of thing, but actually is essentially and foremost a bodily thing. No amount of talking therapies alone can cure trauma. Number 29. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also, and I want you to notice this, an imprint left by that experience on the mind, brain, and body. It's an imprint. Okay, it's something that really leaves a mark. So I'm going to skip the section on, I'll let you read it by yourself, meaning of empathy and compassion, because this is what I'm going to mention at the end now in these final considerations. So I want to go to number 32, can human suffering be too much? Which is the title of the talk, and is the reason why I chose this novel, to meditate about this particular point. Can human suffering be too much? So in the attempt to offer a preliminary map to the question of evil and suffering, I think that Yanagihara's novel exposes the ways evil hides in the depth of our psyche and body, resists verbalization, explanation, solution. So if we want, and we will, think about the issue of evil and suffering, and it is legitimate to do it, we should set our hopes very low, because by definition, evil is something that hides. Evil is something that resists verbalization, explanation, and solution. We might not be aware on a personal level of traumatic experiences that disrupt our lives and impact our behaviors in ways that are destructive of ourselves and of others, in the ways that we see in this novel. But this is how evil works. It leaves an imprint that is not conscious, resists explanation or verbalization, and generates compulsive behaviors. And mind you, traumas are not just individual. Races undergo trauma. We know what has happened in this country. I mean, you cannot belong to a race that has been enslaved and that has been downtrodden for hundreds of years and not have an imprint that might make your life more difficult. Gender is itself associated to trauma. You cannot be, and you cannot grow up as a gay person in a homophobic environment without somehow having inheriting or kind of being subject to something like a traumatic experience that then generates compulsive behaviors. There's a lot of literature about the fact, people often tend to judge very harshly the compulsive or the compulsive ways that characterize sex life, often in the gay world. Well, but what people don't see is what is the trauma, which might not be necessarily individual, must be associated to belonging to a certain gender that or a certain kind of that generates these behaviors, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to show you how to see that why consideration of kind of being exposed to what trauma does in the life of one person helps us to step back a little bit and see that the mechanism is at work much more widely. If we connect Yanagihara's novel to William Golding's Lord of the Flies, and I will be doing this all the time, so don't worry, even if we've seen a novel and we go to the next one, I'm going to keep connecting these novels or the points I'm trying to highlight with each other to make the points I'm trying to convey. So in this case, if we connect Yanagihara's novel to William Golding's Lord of the Flies, we find similar traits. Initially, if you remember, the boys who survive the plane accident on the island do not show any sign of being particularly prone to post-traumatic self-destructive behaviors. Okay, they seem like, fine, nothing seems to have happened, everything seems okay. The equivalent of Jude's suicidal and self-harming behavior, however, appears when fear and will to power, as we saw last time, lead the boys to relinquish the only means of survival, the fire. This is suicidal behavior. Silence, by murder, the voices that can help them to overcome their animal instincts and their fears. So the voice of Piggy, representing reason, and of Simon, representing spiritual resources, and then eventually destroy the entire habitat by setting the island on fire. And what Golding is very good at conveying is the inevitability of what happens. Now, we might decide that this is not a fair representation of humanity, but there is a strong argument for what is arguing, is showing in the novel. We saw above that trauma is not just an event that took place sometimes in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, the brain, and the body. That we are not aware of this imprint until it starts influencing our behavior in compulsive, destructive, and self-destructive ways, and that it resists therapy and attempts to prevent or repair the damage. Now, however problematic, and we talked about this, if you remember, and I told you what I think about this, however problematic the Christian doctrine of original sin might be, well, it does gesture towards something similar. A traumatic experience at some formative point of the history of humanity, or traumatic experiences that condition our life in the present. It's entirely possible, just as it happens as I told you, in races in certain countries, etc. It might be happening at the level of the whole humanity. The fact that we do not remember it, that there is no historical record of it, that it is forgotten or repressed, is what it makes it a trauma, gives it power to disrupt us in the present in ways that are, to some degree at least, compulsive. Finally, Yanagihara's novel invites us to reflect on the notion of compassion and in the presence of suffering. And this, for me, has been probably the most important aspect of this novel. This is how do you position yourself? I mean, position is even the right word. How you stay there, how you witness, how accompany already is too strong a word, because it is impossible to accompany. Even his friends and the people who loved him were unable to do it. What do you do in the presence of suffering that does not want or cannot repair, cannot heal? So reflect on the notion of compassion, number 34, in the presence of suffering, and especially on our urge to think that suffering, whether of other people or of ours, can be given meaning only if it ushers in some level of healing and repairing. We have a hard time really being exposed to suffering that doesn't lead anywhere, that does not want to heal. There is the tragic possibility that suffering is too much, that it damages people beyond the possibility of healing and repairing. And mind you, we should not forget that this is exactly the kind of suffering presented in the Gospel's passion narrative. Forget the resurrection. The resurrection is an event of another order. What we have is the representation of a suffering in Jesus that completely destroys him. And destroys him physically, destroys him socially, destroys him spiritually, because he dies, and we're going to see this, he dies doubting God, doubting the Father. Oh God, why have you forsaken me? He cannot have espoused the suffering of Jude St. Francis more, and all the suffering which destroys really the lives of people. So it is at the heart of our faith. Even the disciples' attitude after Jesus' death on the cross presents some of the traits of a traumatic experience. They are afraid, paralyzed, scattered, and have lost hope. Christian faith is indeed pervaded by a potent hope for healing, okay? And there is a theology of healing. We are going to talk about this. So it's not a healing is not possible. And I'm not talking about curing. I'll make a distinction between curing and healing. Curing is overcoming the physical aspect of illness, but there is a healing which is much, much deeper. It can help curing, and this is what Christianity and faith and spirituality gives us. So it's not that this element is not present in Christianity, and yet Christianity is not afraid of facing a suffering that, as with the cross, annihilates lives, a suffering which unfortunately very present in the world that seem to lead nowhere. It might not be intentional, that this is my final remark, that the name of the main character of Hanya Yanagihara's novel is Jude St. Francis. This is something which dawned on me only yesterday, okay, after having thought about all this. St. Francis is the saint of the stigmata, the marks in the flesh resembling the wounds of the crucified body of Christ. It suggests, at least to us, that Jude's self-harming can be seen as a form of stigmata. It might be a form of irony on the part of the novelist, I really don't know. She doesn't explain. But she doesn't have to, and the novel does not belong to the author. The novel, once it's published, belongs to the readers. So it's up to us to make sense of them. And often the novelist's explanations really make it more difficult. So probably it's even better to read a novel without knowing what the novelist wanted to do. So it might be a form of irony on the part of the novelist, but it can also point to the paradox represented by Christianity. Faith, and think about this. Faith, we believe in a character, Jesus, whose life, like Jude St. Francis, was damaged beyond repair. Okay? Which means, at very least, that we have nothing to be afraid, which is easy to say, but at least, from the point of faith, nothing to be afraid, or at least we should not be afraid to face even what seems an evil that destroys the lives. And, we see this all around us. I mean, we are very, very privileged, as we know, although the appearance can deceive most of the time. Let's not forget that Jude was wealthy, was a successful lawyer, was character like those we are surrounded by. So trauma can hide itself to that level, to that point. But, we are surrounded by, in the world today, by a kind of suffering that destroys lives. And a consideration of the issue of evil cannot close the eyes towards this. Cannot be just, oh, evil makes sense only to the extent that we can repair it, or only to the extent that we can overcome it. Only evil is a reality that imposes itself, and we have to look it in the face in all its horror. And this is what I think this novel helps us to do more than any theoretical explanation of it. So we are going to carry on this reflection. So I leave you hanging, I know, but there is more to come. So let us end with a prayer. O gracious and holy Father, give us wisdom to perceive you, intelligence to understand you, diligence to seek you, patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, a heart to meditate upon you, and a life to proclaim you through the power of the Spirit of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. And see you in Mass.
Where did you get that novel and what compelled you to read it?
A friend just told me read it.
That's what I thought.
that was it. Yeah. Bye. Oh, that's okay. That's okay. You have.